Michelle, and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 12, My Ancestors, take a little detour from the history of Canada, but not a big one. I wish to explore my ancestors who were some of the earliest habitants or settlers of New France. They joined Champlain in his efforts to establish the colony of Quebec. So in fact, they are part of the history of Canada. And just so you know, some of the details presented here will be a slight repeat of the previous video on Samuel de Champlain as I weave in the story of my ancestors. I'll also be jumping ahead near the end, but just a little as I close off on this topic, but I will get back to those time frames in later videos. As a homage, I also want to mention that my late brother Denis spent years of travel and research in contacting old churches, archives, and local governments, both here in Canada and in France, to build a very extensive family tree, a tree that goes back almost 500 years. Okay, moving on. I mentioned in the last video that Champlain brought Louis Hébert, his wife Marie Rolette, and their 3 children to Quebec in 1608. Louis is known as the first original habitant of New France. Well, Louis and Marie are my 9 times great-grandparents. Wow. Colonization was slow and difficult at first, with many settlers dying early due to bad weather and disease. By 1630, there were only 103 colonists living in Quebec, with several of these being my ancestors. But that would soon grow to 355 by 1640, again, several of these being my direct ancestors. My next 2 ancestors to join the settlement of Quebec were Abraham Martin, my 10 times great-grandfather, and his brother-in-law, Pierre Desportes, my 9 times great-grandfather, who both arrived on the same ship in the summer of 1617. As mentioned in episode 11, Champlain had some of his men live with the local indigenous peoples to learn their language and customs. One of these more famous coureurs de bois was Médard de Groseilliers. Groseilliers made large contributions to early Canada as an explorer and fur trader and was my 8 times great uncle. More on Médard in a minute. For the next decade, only a few French people lived in the colony. So back in France in 1627, to help increase the population from just 85 colonists at the time, Cardinal Richelieu founded a company of 100 associates to invest in New France. My 9 times great-grandfather, Pierre Desportes, was an investor in this group. He was also a lawyer in the Parliament of Paris, and while in the colony of Quebec, he managed a warehouse in the settlement. Then in July of 1620, Pierre Desportes had a daughter named Hélène Desportes. Hélène would be my 8 times great-grandmother. What's interesting about Hélène is that she's listed in some genealogy records as the first white child, and in other records as the first child of European ancestry to be born in Canada. This doesn't mean that there weren't other children born before Hélène in New France. Originally, there were very few European women in the colony. They were mostly male explorers and male settlers. And any offspring between local indigenous peoples and Europeans were called Métis, peoples of mixed European, primarily French, and indigenous ancestry. The Métis became the 3rd recognized group of First Nations and Inuit peoples by the Constitution Act of 1982. Anyways, at birth, Hélène's godmother was Madame Hélène Boulet, the wife of Samuel de Champlain, and in his will, as a sign of their relationship, Samuel de Champlain left Hélène Desportes 300 pounds, about $28,000 today. A tiny sum. 9 years later, after the initial fall of Quebec City in 1629 to the Kirke brothers, Hélène and her parents, along with Champlain, as prisoner, were transported back to London, England, then back to France. Shortly after, when peace was restored in New France in 1632, Hélène Desportes returned to Quebec on May 16, 1633. Hélène then married Joseph Guillaume Hébert on October 1st, 1634. Joseph was the son of Louis Hébert and Marie Rolette, the original habitants, my 9 times great-grandparents, as I mentioned earlier. Sadly, Joseph soon died in 1639, and Hélène remarried Noël Morin on 9 January 1640. These unions produced 19 children. One of her sons, Germain Morin, my 7 times great-uncle, was consecrated into the priesthood in September of 1665 by Monseigneur Laval, another early and very famous figure in Canadian history. Germain is the first Canadian-born priest to be ordained in New France. Another wow. Another of Hélène's son was Jean-Baptiste Morin, also my 7 times great-uncle. He was a member of the Conseil Souverain de Nouvelle-France, the Sovereign Council of New France, which was the governing body of the new colony and responsible for the colony's administration and laws. And then there's Hélène's daughter, Marie Morin, my 7 times great-aunt. She became the first Canadian-born nun. And later in life, in 1693, Marie then became the first Canadian-born Mother Superior of the Hôtel Dieu de Montréal, a major hospital in Montreal that is still in operation to this day. As Marie aged, she was asked to write her memoirs by the sisterhood to record her life and the work of their companions who had come to New France. Marie wrote, quote, "I have more knowledge of these things than many others. Without speaking rashly, and being the first girl that they received into their company in the 3rd year after their arrival in Canada, I have had the good fortune to be an eyewitness of almost everything that they have done and suffered, and do not think, my sisters, that I exaggerate, but be assured, as is the case, that this is only the smallest part of what could be told, and that it is for your recreation that I take pleasure in writing this." End quote. Her memoirs still survive to this day. Their authenticity are a treasure of the history of Montreal and of Canada. Through these pages, we can rediscover the amazing personality of Sister Morin, a type of heroic woman produced in the early days of New France. Another amazing wow. Now I'll jump ahead by almost 100 years to the end of New France, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City in 1759. It's at this point in history that my 10 times great-grandfather, Abraham Martin, comes late to the picture. I mentioned earlier that he came to New France in 1617 with his brother-in-law Pierre Desportes, my 9 times great-grandfather. Sadly, Abraham died in 1664 in Quebec City before the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759. However, his lands were still owned by his children. His name is given to 2 famous Quebec City landmarks to this day, Les Côtes d'Abraham, or the Hills of Abraham, and Les Plaines d'Abraham, or the Plains of Abraham, and of course, to the battle itself, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which was fought on Abraham's farmland just outside the walls of the Fort of Quebec. Another amazing connection with Abraham Martin is his daughter, Hélène Martin, my 8 times great-aunt. On September 3rd, 1647, she married Médard de Groseilliers. As already mentioned, Médard was a coureur de bois and helped co-found the Hudson's Bay Company for the English in 1670. Groseilliers did eventually return to the service of the French in 1676. Well, Médard de Groseilliers is my 8 times great-uncle. Another ancestor, Zachary Cloutier, my 10 times great-grandfather, came to the colony of Quebec in 1634. He is listed in genealogical records as possibly being the ancestor of all Francophones in the Americas. Then there's Bartholomew Gandin, also my 10 times great-grandfather, who came in 1648. And Jean Mignot and François Marguerite, both my 9 times great uncles. Jean came in 1643, and Francois, on January 20th, 1641, was made a prisoner of the Iroquois. And Francois Bélanger, my 9 times great grandfather, was the captain of the militia in Beaupré from 1663 to 1677. And Joseph Hébert, my 8 times great grandfather, who was killed by the Iroquois on the island of Orleans in 1661. Well, there's more, but that's all I wish to say about my ancestors. They were among the very first settlers, the original habitants, and I'm very proud of them and these facts. Like I mentioned in the previous video, without Champlain and these habitants, many being my ancestors, we would not have had a New France, nor a Quebec, nor a bilingual country of French and English languages and cultures in Canada. Well, that's it for the short history of my ancestors in New France. Please stay tuned for our next episode, episode 13, The Jesuits. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. Okay.